Mission for online U.S. equity trades.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Election security has become a big issue with reports of Russia and others trying to influence how we elect our leaders. The Center for Election Innovation and Research is a nonprofit, bipartisan organization working across the country with officials to make sure our elections are working properly and free of outside influence. Welcome now David Becker. He's executive director of the center. Mr. Becker worked as a trial lawyer in the voting section of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. So David, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So give us a sense of where we are right now on election security compared to 2018, but really 2016 is what people focus on.
Right.
Have we improved?
We've improved a great deal in spite of the very real threat that's coming from Russia and perhaps other foreign adversaries. The bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee, the Mueller report, all confirmed that Russia indeed did attack us in 2016. They attempted to interfere with our elections. They attempted to infiltrate election infrastructure and technology. But also, just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, they inundated us with disinformation about our elections and the whole process, seeking to divide us as a nation and get us to lose confidence in our process. And I don't think there's any question they were pretty successful. Since that time, that was a real wake-up call for us. And since that time, the Department of Homeland Security has really worked to partner with the states and the local governments, all of whom are responsible for running elections in the United States, to make sure that we're going to be more secure.
So you said it, local governments, because the elections in the United States are really run sort of like public schools are.
Yeah.
It's a local level. How can you coordinate across thousands of different election units?
Well, it's a process. It's difficult. I mean, there's got to be a lot of information sharing. Of course, the federal government has access to much more information about threats than the states and local election officials do. But the state and local election officials know much more about their voters and how their elections are run, and voting times, polling places, what's on the ballot. All are different in every jurisdiction. So on November 3rd, 2020, we're not going to have one election in the United States. We're going to have about 10,000 small elections in the United States. But that's also an advantage in some ways, because it's a lot harder for a foreign adversary to attack 10,000 different election offices than it is to attack maybe one election office.
You say we've made progress. Do people feel that we've made progress? Do people have confidence? Because if you look at polls, people are not in a panic about it, but you see a not insignificant percentage of people who say, you know, I've got real doubts about the votes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. A recent poll came out that said about 40% of all Americans won't trust that the election was fair if their candidate loses. That's a real problem. And I think one of the challenges election officials have is they have to address the real vulnerabilities that exist, and they do exist. And we've come a long way in securing them, but they also have to convince voters that they should trust the election. So for instance, it's a consensus recommendation that we have paper ballots. Paper ballots are important so that we can confirm the voter has seen this paper ballot after they've left and still go back to that paper and count it if we need to. And those paper ballots and audits are really important. But the truth is about 90%, maybe more, of all voters will vote on paper ballots in 2020. That's the most non-punch card paper ballots that we've seen in modern history. And in fact, that includes every voter in all of the battleground states. So we're going to have paper ballots in all of the battleground states, audits of those ballots to confirm the outcome was right as well.
What's left to be done, and does it require money?
It requires a lot of money and resources. There's no finish line in cybersecurity. We're going to need to be ready to address this threat for the foreseeable future. And there's just not enough resources in the election offices to do that. It's not just buying new equipment and keeping that equipment up to date and implementing cybersecurity around that equipment. That's all very important, and that costs money. But it's also hiring and training skilled staff and paying this skilled staff commensurate with what the private sector might pay them. That's going to require millions of dollars to do, and we should invest that kind of money, both from Congress and the state legislatures, to make sure that election officials have the resources they need.
Going back to 2016, as I understand it, there was some indication, I think the federal government told some local election officials that, in fact, there were attempts to try to interfere with the voting process. Is there any reason to believe any votes were miscounted as a result of that?
We've looked at the 2016 election probably more than any election in American history, and we've yet to find any evidence that any votes were actually altered. Now, we know that the Russians, for instance, successfully got into the Illinois voter database.
Right.
They didn't change anything. We've been able to confirm that. They might have gotten into another Florida county. We haven't seen any effects of that. It's very likely that those attempts were designed not so much to change anything, but to get us to doubt our own systems, so that we would then lose confidence in the elections and those who were elected under them in their ultimate governance of our nation.
So you talked about two different ways in which foreign entities could interfere. One is by actually how we count the votes. The other is with disinformation and really trying to change what people decide when they go into the voting booths. Their vote will be counted right, but they were influenced in their vote, presumably, by what was said. What's to be done about that? That sounds like a much more difficult problem.
It's much more difficult. I don't work so much in that area. It's obviously it's wrapped up with a lot of very legitimate First Amendment concerns and other things. One of the things I'm really concerned about is disinformation that might relate to the election process as it is. So disinformation that says there's really long lines at polling places when there's not, or that voting might occur at times when it doesn't, or directing people to the wrong place, or saying the machines are flipping votes. That's happening, and that's originating in other countries as well as within the United States, and it's very important election officials have the tools necessary to combat that.
You raise a very important point, because we have heard reports of different countries around the world being affected, often by Russia, maybe not exclusive of Russia, but often Russia seems to come up in the discussion. What have we been able to learn from those? Have we been able to gone to school, and for example, in England there were reports there were some effect. France, there was a report. Have we been able to learn from that to protect ourselves?
I think what we've seen, especially with regard to disinformation, is some countries have developed very strong and transparent methods for combating disinformation. France had some success with that. Some Scandinavian countries have as well. It's still very difficult. We have to build a fence around the entire process. They have to just punch one hole in the fence. And so we're going to need resources to be able to combat against that. And the world's democracies are going to need to come together, because what we're seeing right now in the United States isn't much different than what we're seeing in the UK or in Israel and other places, where democratically elected governments find themselves somewhat paralyzed by attacks from autocracies, and the result is that legislatures can't act.
In the United States, talk about the org chart, as it were. I mean, who is the quarterback who's making sure that we protect our election process? Because there's almost nothing I can think of that would be more important than to know that our votes are counted correctly.
So traditionally, we haven't had a single quarterback. It's like we have 50 different quarterbacks. Each state has a chief election official. Often it's the Secretary of State, but sometimes it's a state board of elections. And those people are all working hard to work with their local jurisdictions, often counties or sometimes even municipalities, to make sure that they all have the tools they need to secure the election. That being said, it requires a remarkable level of coordination. There's not a single person where the buck stops. So this is why it's been so important that the Department of Homeland Security has partnered with the Secretaries of State, the state election directors, and then also worked within those states down to their county and local election officials to try to get the word out how they can better secure their systems and have better cyber hygiene.
David, given all that you know and all your experience, if there were one thing you could do, you were czar, one thing you could do to really protect our elections in 2020, what would it be?
Well, I'm going to give you two answers.
Okay, fair enough.
One is from the perspective of government. Government needs to fund better paper-based election systems and require audits of those systems nationwide, and we're moving towards that goal. We're farther along than we've ever been, but there's still a ways to go. And then from the voter's perspective, we as citizens, the best thing we can do is vote. And this isn't just some Pollyanna-ish idea about democracy. Each vote is a data point. When someone votes, particularly if they vote early or by mail, election officials get a data point that they can look at. And if foreign adversaries have done something to that voter's record or done something else to negatively impact the election process, we'll know it. So if you want to fight back against foreign adversaries, show up and vote.
Okay, thank you so much, David. Really good to have you with us.
Thanks, David.
That is David Becker. He's Executive Director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research. And we're going to have more with Mr. Becker coming up at 1 o'clock this afternoon on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up here, Bloomberg News is reporting that Rudy Giuliani is under federal investigation for possible campaign finance violations. What does that mean?